some technology issues here today, so hopefully everything will go smoothly and work as planned. And I'll talk a little bit, and I'm going to read a little bit from some things and show some images in the sort of latter part of the talk, and give you a sense for the full experience of the book. And first, let me just say thank you to Carol Willis and to the staff of the Skyscraper Museum for hosting this and for helping me to do this today. So I'm going to speak about some of the things that I discovered in researching and writing this new book, Manhattan Projects: The Rise and Fall of Urban Renewal in Cold War New York. And to do this, I'm going to jump in right away with a story to give you to set the stage in one place where this urban renewal rose and fell, so to speak. And this is taken from the archives. It's a story I found in the archives up at in Sleepy Hollow, where the Rockefeller family keeps all their materials. And it's the sort of traces, the historical traces of an event, a little noted and in many ways long forgotten event that has sort of been captured in a document. And the document itself is the script of a one-act musical comedy that was called A Day at Lincoln Square. And it was performed at a Christmas dinner party in 1958. And the party was thrown by a real estate firm by the name of Braceland, Porter and Wheelock. Now, Braceland, Porter and Wheelock, who I'll call BPW for short, was the firm that the Lincoln Center sponsors, the organization that was set up by the Rockefeller family and the other folks who got involved in building Lincoln Center, the firm that they hired to handle the relocation of tenants from the site of Lincoln Center and of some of the other institutional components of the overall Lincoln Square urban renewal project. And so this was their Christmas dinner, and one of their employees, this is right in the middle, 1958 is right in the middle of the relocations for Lincoln Square. So it's right during the time when there's a lot of controversy around Lincoln Square that I'll get into a little bit later. And it's right when they're starting to grapple with the fact that this wasn't going to be quite as easy as they thought it would be, quite as simple a process. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit from the book where I talk about what this play was like. It's called, again, as I said, A Day at Lincoln Square. And it was intended basically as a kind of little piece of lighthearted comic relief, a tale about the recalcitrance of the tenants of Lincoln Square, and their sort of unwillingness to face the inevitability of change. Okay, so the curtain opens on the author of the play, this guy who was an employee named Charles D. Atkinson. He plays the narrator in this. And he also has with him a three-man chorus who they introduce together the story. The narrator starts in, "Well, what kind of a day has it been? A day like any other day," he responded, answering his own question. And then the chorus jumped in and says, "It was a day to try the patience of a landlord's soul. A day when 10 families stopped doing their washing on the future stage of the Metropolitan Opera. A day when Bach and Beethoven evicted Harvey's Bar and Grill. It was," the narrator then concluded, "a day when 10 hula hoops circled 64th Street no more. A day in which history was made at Lincoln Square, and you are there." And then the curtain opened, right? And that's that term echoing the famous TV show of the era. And then the chorus begins to sing as the scene is introduced, delivering the theme of the entire play in this sort of mocking tone that signaled this sort of shared sense of exasperation that they all had with this tenant recalcitrance. "It's a terrible, terrible, terrible crisis," they sang. "No one will move uptown, no one will move down." I won't try to get the tune, I'm not really even sure what it is. "The brokers are charging impossible prices, and some of the tenants are starting to frown." Then next, a tenant enters, singing, "I will move anywhere, anywhere, anywhere. If you'll be reasonable, I'm not hard to please." But then he reels off this list of places he wouldn't go. Queens is too aristocratic. The Bronx is a zoo. You can't fool me. Kings, meaning, of course, Brooklyn. I put that in the book, and then I remember when I come to New York, no one needs to be told that. Sorry. Kings are undemocratic, and Jersey is too far away under the sea. Besides, Brooklyn is much like Siberia. It's almost as far away and barren and cold since the Dodgers went west. So he's saying he'll move anywhere, 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 as long as anywhere is in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s indeed. My dog has asthma, won't let him climb a stair. A home like my old one is just what I need. So then the chorus comes back in again and says, he will move anywhere, 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 50s, the 60s, the 70s indeed. His dog has asthma, won't let him climb a stair. But then they alter the last line to remind themselves who truly had the tenant's best interests at heart in their minds. A home like his old one is not what he needs. So they deliver the overall theme, and the narrator then introduces the setting. 137 West 64th Street is this old brownstone, 4 stories high, they say, which is about to be immortalized in the annals of relocation. The main character comes on, a guy named Esplanado de Santiago, an old man 4 stories high. And then he comes on with an employee of Braceland, Porter, and Wheelock, a character who's called in the script in this sort of interesting and I thought kind of endearing gesture of self-deprecation, which signifies both his job as the relocation coordinator for that block and the sort of dogged, self-defeating perseverance with which he pursued his duties. He's called the BPW blockhead, right? So the two go through this absurdist back and forth in which the blockhead tries to get DeSantiago into a taxi to go over to the new apartment that the firm has found for him, and DeSantiago keeps stalling by asking about sort of what seem to be sort of absurd things. There's this bird cage that he can't move without, and he's hoping that his 38-year-old canary, Simon Bolivar, would one day return to him, and he wanted to be ready. Finally, though, he said goodbye to the home of his youth, and he got in the cab. Now, 20 minutes later, somehow 20 minutes pass, and the narrator informs the audience that DeSantiago returns, unhappy with his new home. I don't like the neighborhood. It ain't my style. It ain't my class. The blockhead is stunned. Did he get to the right place? Sure I did, replied DeSantiago. Sure I went to the right place. Where you sent me? Over to the east side near the river. The building is over 100 years old, and there's no one living within 100 yards of the place. The cops have got it surrounded, and besides, I don't like the name. Gracie Mansion? So, all right, the punchline's delivered. Even the chance to live in the mayor's official residence is not enough to overcome this kind of tenant bullheadedness and ignorance. So the chorus sweeps back in to end the play, summing up this sort of triumphant endeavor of Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, Fordham University, will be built here in many parts, surmounting all adversity. Tenants are living much closer to paradise. Theater, symphony, opera, ballet, millions of lives will be filled with zest and spice, a wonderful sight for us to display. One of the most interesting things about this document was that it was not just a sort of printed document. It had a bunch of pictures with it, too, hand-drawn pictures, which I unfortunately can't, they were very light and don't reproduce well. But there is sort of a handmade program for the night, which included the script, the score, the series of these drawings that go with it, sort of cartoonish drawings, illustrating the story. So the most notable illustration is of DeSantiago as this kind of perplexed, disgruntled, and mustachioed man who's squatting barefoot inside his own bird cage, like a trapped animal or a traveling curiosity, a sort of disturbing image labeled To Gracie Mansion. But other images were less provocative than that, displaying not sort of suppressed disdain for the residents, but a sort of an attempt to offer the residents a shared sense of collective endeavor. The title page, for instance, was decorated with a ceremonial drawing of a crossed pick and a violin, the implements of destruction and rebirth at Lincoln Square, while the cover and closing page are depicted in the way in which the tenants, despite their own recalcitrance, would be transformed from bitter, displaced persons into joyful participants in the pageant of urban resurgence that the Lincoln Center sponsors hoped to set forth. So on the cover, there's this sort of desultory family of 6 lined up with packed bags, ready to make way for the Opera House and the great open plaza that's actually sketched in just behind them, if you can imagine. And by the end of the play, though, on the back cover, the family had been transformed, and they themselves had ended up as sort of performers in the drama that was being staged. celebrating their move that much closer to paradise, as the play put it. So the two youngest kids portray Romeo and Juliet. The eldest son bangs on a drum kit, mother sings an aria, dad toots on a horn. And the eldest daughter holds up a banner wishing Braceland, Porter, and Wheelock employees a happy new year. So this sort of kind of leaving open the interpretation for this is this idea that I think that the sponsors of Lincoln Center are wanting their audience to see everybody involved as in a shared kind of sense of sacrifice. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but let's first, in order to give you a sense of how this fits into the larger project, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I might notice this kind of ephemera, why I might notice this sort of bit of light entertainment in the archives and think of it as a meaningful piece of evidence. What can it tell us about the subject of my book, Urban Renewal in Manhattan in the 20 years after World War II? It sort of reminds me, I think, that looking at something like this may make me the least high-risey of your guests. But it's the kind of thing that I like to notice, or I find myself noticing, because I think that in part it's because I am an urban historian with some training in architectural history, but I'm also, and primarily, I think, a cultural and intellectual historian. I'm fascinated by the ways that cities have been shaped physically, but also the ways they've been imagined, and the conflicts in the realm of the imagination, of how people come to square off in different positions around the fate of the city. I'm always interested in these intellectual and symbolic dimensions of city life, the deeper visions and conflicts that have spurred urban history. And this is what drew me, I think, to a topic like urban renewal in New York, which led me to try to put some fresh light on a topic that has been much studied, as Carol was suggesting in her introduction. So usually we think of urban renewal basically as a policy, as a set of urban politics and policies. And when I talk about urban renewal, I mean a very specific thing when it comes to policy. I mean the campaigns to remake cities that were authorized and funded by the United States Housing Act of 1949. And we can trace that history as a series of political decisions and urban policies, and how urban renewal was essentially an attempt to solve fiscal and economic problems in the aftermath of World War II. And looking at it this way, urban renewal was essentially an attempt to head off suburbanization. How come it's doing that? Oh. It doesn't want to go back. Well, just give it a second, it'll go back. We hope. Jumping the gun here. So it's an attempt to attract capital back to central cities by giving the federal government the fiscal wherewithal to attract private developers who wanted to undertake these redevelopment projects in cities. Now, many of us are familiar with the results of these policies, right? They bulldozed the old 19th century city to clear away what they thought of as slums and blight and replace it with this new modern cityscape, influenced by what was then the state of the art in modern architectural and urban planning theory. Superblock plans, you've just seen a little bit of this, dotted with austere modern buildings, the so-called towers in the park ideal. Now, my book deals with many of these details, and you'll see some of this in a minute. But urban renewal has attracted so much attention, I think, and become sort of lodged in so many people's minds because it was much more than a policy. I think in many ways it was kind of a vision of how cities could be rescued, a vision that sparked a series of conflicts and struggles over how Americans should live in cities, over how they should think about urban life in this post-war era. And these were political conflicts. They were played out by social movements, by groups, and I'll talk about a little bit about this. But they were also cultural struggles, in the sense that they were struggles over the meaning of city life, the fundamental sense of what it meant to live in cities. Now, a great deal of the source of these struggles over meaning actually did result from conflict over what the impact of these modern planning and architectural ideals truly was, how it was impacting the city. And across the course of the 1950s, New York and other cities, people in these cities asked themselves whether these massive transformations that were going on were fulfilling their promise. Were they truly development? Were they truly progress? Or were they actually some form of destruction? Were they actually markers of loss? Were these new plans markers of loss in the cityscape rather than progress? So supporters of urban renewal had very idealistic and pragmatic goals that they rolled out in these years. They hoped, as I suggested, to make urban property profitable and bring usually the white middle class back downtown. But they also wanted to rehouse slum dwellers, to rationalize and order a chaotic, unplanned city. And particularly in Manhattan, they wanted to supply the city with a modern built environment equal to what they saw as New York's role as capital of the world in the post-war era. So Manhattan's urban renewal boosters hoped that urban renewal would help project an image and an ideal of modernization and prosperity that would compete with and even surpass the equally grandiose visions of progress that were on offer in our global competitor in that era, the Soviet Union. Thus the Cold War subtext in my subtitle. Opponents, on the other hand, saw urban renewal as a symbol of far less promising and grand developments. It literally meant the destruction and loss of numerous working-class neighborhoods. It perpetuated the deindustrialization, that was eroding working-class livelihoods, and it fostered increased racial segregation. But urban renewal's opponents also saw the effects of its plans as this kind of absolutist, overwhelming imposition on older patterns of city life. What was modern, clean, and rational for urban renewal's backers was too often for them alienating or regimented. And many of them thought it had a social and aesthetic impact that was more suited to a kind of totalitarian regime rather than the United States. So they too saw these projects in light of images and ideas motivated by the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. So Manhattan Projects is concerned with the way that urban renewal formed as a vision of remaking cities, how it was put into practice in actual places in the Manhattan cityscape, and then how it was undone by the counter-visions of those who lived in the places that urban renewal left in its wake. Now, as Carol suggested, I'm hoping to go beyond, I've hoped to go beyond the usual sort of Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs story, as the rise and fall of urban renewal has often been told in New York. They are characters in my book, important characters in my book. But what I hope to do is place Robert Moses in a much larger context, in the context of those who he depended upon to get his projects built, and the sort of wider cast of folks who were there promoting projects, and to see some of the idealism behind their projects as well, and in Moses himself. And then when it comes to Jane Jacobs, I hope to give us a longer history in which Jane Jacobs sits. Too often we think of Death and Life of Great American Cities, her great book, as being the kind of flashpoint of the undoing of urban renewal, and it just came out of nowhere. I think it's important to see the larger citywide movement against urban renewal that Jacobs' book is in some sense a product of, and in some sense joins this movement, that it joins sort of midstream and helps to crystallize and catalyze in very important ways. Now, to do this, I look at 4 case studies, exemplary projects that provide a glimpse into how urban renewal was made and unmade in these years. So I guess what I thought I would do with this is I would show you some images from the 4 projects that I have, and hopefully we can make this work well enough. The first, of course, was the United Nations headquarters. We can go to the first slide here. And the UN headquarters was, in many ways, the first project in the age of urban renewal, in some sense, in the sense that it was not technically an urban renewal project because it wasn't supported by the federal government, but in many ways it brought the vision of modern planning outside of public housing to American shores for the first time in the post-war era. And it also, I think, most importantly, gives urban renewal a kind of added element or added charge of intellectual sophistication and legitimacy that it might not have had otherwise. And that's particularly true in New York. Next slide. We always think of the Secretariat of the United Nations as the first of the international style glass skin skyscrapers in Manhattan, one of the first in the United States. But I also discovered that people were really fascinated by the way that it represented a kind of new model for this new mode of urban planning that would then become de rigueur in urban renewal. So what it did was, next slide, it was intended, of course, to replace this old cityscape, in this case at Turtle Bay, next, where there were a host of slaughterhouses and undesirable uses. that really still stood there right up until World War II, where, as this article reminds us, the sheep were led to the slaughter by this unfortunately named goat at the top, who was called Judas. And this was, going on in the streets of Turtle Bay right up until the end of the war. And the United Nations sought to implant, next slide, a whole new sort of spatial model in the cityscape, right? This sort of new vision of how cities should be planned and thought about. Next slide. One that would feature open spaces, green spaces modeled on avant-garde forms of European urbanism. But it, of course, gave it a whole different set of ideals, too, right? Because it was blending both the UN's internationalist vision with this urban vision. So it sort of seemed for many people to hold this symbolic role, that both the world would be redeemed through the UN's mission of world peace, and the city would be redeemed through the UN's example in the cityscape, and that this had a kind of energy that would help to inspire New Yorkers to transform their cityscape. Next slide. Into something that would be more modern, more fitting for a world-class city. So this is an idea for what might have happened along 47th Street, where they hoped to create this grand modern promenade that would lead to the UN complex. It never was fulfilled. But this is the kind of vision of how the UN would remake the city around it, and hopefully all of the city, into a city that symbolized the UN's linked goals, both on the international stage and the urban stage, and confirm New York's status as the capital of the world. So that was the UN. Then further down the island, next slide, just down there on the east side, MetLife's massive middle-income development that we're all familiar with, Stuyvesant Town, came in around the same year, started a little bit earlier, actually. Next slide. That features, that also got rid of, just like the UN did, got rid of an old working-class district, intended to clear away the so-called slums and blight, in this case of the Gas House District, which were 18 blocks of working-class apartments and businesses between 23rd and 14th Street west of First Avenue. And actually, so these images are of the Gas House District just before they were knocked down by MetLife. And these images of this entire neighborhood exist only in one place now, which is in the archives of MetLife. This sort of ghostly archive of every street and every storefront and every facade in these 18 blocks. So that's another view of a backyard in the Gas House District. You can see some more of these views in the book itself. Next one. And so these were destroyed during the war. Many of these images and this reality of this reminded New Yorkers, many New Yorkers who had been fighting in the war, of what they'd seen in Europe not too long before. Right? This is 1945 and 46, just after people are getting home and they're knocking down the Gas House District. And it was replaced by a landscape next that the company called a suburb in the city. From those ruins would spring this new kind of place. A place which, like the UN, was influenced by modern planning and urbanism with some significant changes that I won't go into now. You can read about it. These green swaths and towers in the park. But Stuyvesant Town introduced a veritable storm of controversy. And the controversy was over a number of issues. Next slide. Many of which were about the sort of urban design and impact of the place. Right. This was the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which was a liberal planning organization still around today, who identified many of the problems that they saw with this design. I won't go into the details of this, but there was also, of course, other controversies. The major controversy that dogged Stuyvesant Town for its first views was that it was segregated. Next slide. And there was a whole organization within the project that was devoted to tearing down segregation. This is a pamphlet from the organization within Stuyvesant Town that wanted to desegregate it, that was being attacked, and the leaders of it were being evicted. So they created this pamphlet to try to rally money for their cause. And so segregation was a huge issue. MetLife eventually desegregated Stuyvesant Town under pressure from these civil rights activists within the complex. But also at the same time, we would be remiss to not see Stuyvesant Town as a kind of democratic space in many ways. Next slide. it's representative of a sort of democratic spirit. And one of the things that I look at is the way that people tried to live there, to make a middle-class life in what was seen at that time as a very mass housing complex, a kind of place that would be difficult for a middle-class life. And they were very much helped by the post-war consumer economy. Now, this ad for an old Manhattan department store, Ludwig Bauman, shows Stuyvesant Town featured as a target market, you might say, for the post-war consumer economy. And Stuyvesant Town is listed there, it's hard to see, with other post-war housing developments, many of them actually public housing, in a way that's hard to imagine today that any department store or any business would actually market to the residents of public housing, along with middle-class residents of Stuyvesant Town and other private redevelopment undertakings. So that's interesting, and there's some more of these to look at in the book. The next slide is another one. This is Hearn's, which is another local department store that featured a model of a Stuyvesant Town apartment and gave you ways to think about decorating it and to try to make the very standardized rooms of Stuyvesant Town into a home. And there's much talk in the periodicals around Stuyvesant Town during these times about how to transform your Stuyvesant Town apartment into a place that you can live. The next slide shows how far this discourse went. It went right up into House and Garden, the sort of premier homemaking magazine of the era, where it shows this family that's just moved into the sort of maze of Stuyvesant Town and shows how they're trying to find a way to remake their little cluster of rooms within the grid of the maze of Stuyvesant Town. And this sort of conflict between anonymity and newness, between regimentation and hope that Stuyvesant Town exemplified was symbolic in many ways of the whole experience of urban renewal, of the sense that it was a vision for remaking the city that many people welcomed and wanted to see, but that others would end up finding, or some people who had once welcomed it then began to find regimenting, alienating, destructive. And it plays out through many other parts of the history of urban renewal as it gets going. So next slide is Lincoln Square, which is Lincoln Center here, which is my next case study in the book. I'm going to just leave this slide here, leave it at this slide about Lincoln Center for now, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about Lincoln Square in a moment when we return to our opening story. So Lincoln Square, and then the final case study is East Harlem. Next slide. Which was the place that was the most remade by public housing in these years, in the 20 years after World War II. This is a map of many of the different public housing developments that were coming in to East Harlem in these years. It shows how much of East Harlem was actually remade by this new planning ideal. Next slide. And this is a panorama from the early 1960s, I think it is, from 106th and Park. I think it's looking from the tracks of the commuter train, and you can see out to the east there. You see Franklin Plaza, right to the left. In the background are the Wilson houses. To the far right background, you can barely see them here, are the East River houses, the George Washington houses a little bit closer, and clearance right here in the foreground for the DeWitt Clinton houses. So that panorama gives a sense of how much of the old 19th century cityscape was knocked away for that. Some of the places that were built, the next slide is the James Weldon Johnson houses and its playground. Next one is the George Washington houses and some of its rudimentary landscaping. What happened here in East Harlem that I was interested in was not only the transformation of the landscape, but the beginnings of some thinking about how this might have gone too far. And there were some social workers in this area associated with the Union Settlement House who began to look at these new landscapes and the social conditions that were developing within them, and to begin to ask that if the housing that they had really been stumping for years and years was maybe the wrong idea. And they went back and forth about this for a long time, from the mid-50s into the early 60s, trying to figure out what to do. And they settled on a number of things to try to offset some of the social problems that they were seeing that were arising in these developments. So they started tenant organizations within them that did had a lot of different undertakings. But one of the things that I was the most interested in was how their attempts to rethink the design of public housing. And so they they got involved with a number of different architects and planners. You can go to the next slide, including Jane Jacobs, who was just beginning her career in thinking about modern planning and had gotten involved with some of the folks at Union Settlement. And some other folks, and they tried to change the profile of public housing. So this was a prospective plan that they did for the new Clinton houses, the DeWitt Clinton houses that were coming online, and they convinced NYCHA to allow them to come up with an alternative plan that featured low-rise buildings. It still stuck to some of the same ideas, but it tried to knit the fabric of the public housing development back into the city streets in some ways, in ways it hadn't before. This was eventually rejected by NYCHA for violating a number of public housing codes, and DeWitt Clinton houses was built as planned, as you can see on the next slide, and basically stayed in the same model as previous public housing. So they got some other opportunities to try to do this, and one thing that they tried to do was to rethink the landscaping of public housing. So they built a number of interesting, which seem minor now, but at the time were kind of interesting experiments. In the next slide, you can see an experiment in how to remake the open space of the Jefferson houses, I think this is, which was the East Harlem Plaza, which was a very carefully crafted space that was unlike earlier project open space, which is mostly just green space, that was sort of unused by people, just sort of sat there as this kind of artifact. And so they tried to do that, and then a planner by the name of Albert Meyer, in the next slide, came up with some open space designs for the Franklin Plaza, which was a middle-income project that was intended to be brought in to offset the impact of so much public housing in the neighborhood. So he made some interesting designs of very intricate spaces that hoped to restore some of the kind of what they thought of as the intricacy of the surrounding streetscape to the landscape of public housing. Next slide shows a supposed view of it from one of the windows, and again to try to knit the projects back into the streetscape around it. And this, the final slide in this East Harlem section, if you go to the next one, is their revised vision of East Harlem, which they are now calling to try to attract buyers to the Franklin Plaza Cooperative, the new Upper East Side. Right. So now the new Upper East Side extends down here into the 80s and only goes up there to 124th Street, I think it is. Or no, not even that far. It's, I think it's just 116th. Yeah. So this is their attempt to rethink, sort of another reflection on that first map we saw, to rethink this place. Okay, so those are the major case studies, and let's return for a second to Lincoln Square. Next slide. We'll go back to Lincoln Center. To understand each of these places. I actually have it in order from the other one, so you can just go forward. Sorry. Right should be next one. One more. Just a little back. That's giving it away. Such a good image. Okay, so in order to understand the impact these places had on the rise and fall of urban renewal, I look for these unexpected lessons in the archives, these sort of forgotten moments like the Christmas dinner play with which I began, that sort of crystallize the attitudes and understandings of those involved in remaking these places. So we're going to look just quickly at how this worked at Lincoln Square. The little play, I think, shows that the people who put it together had really absorbed the overall vision that floated Lincoln Center in the first place. It was for them to be this kind of project of great national and international significance, the fulfillment of a campaign of urban rebirth and international visibility that was launched with the United Nations arrival a decade earlier. It would use the power of high culture, the performing arts, to rescue the city and confirm New York's status as the so-called capital of the world. And the sort of excitement surrounding Lincoln Center is shown in this next slide, with a promotional image that was shot for West Side Story, of course, that was actually shot. It was shot in a number of different places around Manhattan, but it was actually shot parts of it were shot in the streets that were cleared for Lincoln Center and some of the Lincoln Square urban renewal area. I think this one is somewhere else, but the other parts of it were actually shot in those streets. And this gives you some sense of the kind of the sort of overall cultural excitement building around the idea of Lincoln Center in these years, right? Russ Tamblyn as Riff leaping in front of the flames as the new modern towers rise from the destruction behind. And then in the next slide, we get a sense of the kind of solemn significance that was given to these buildings and to this project. This here is, of course, all the architects and planners of Lincoln Center arrayed inside their models. I'm not going to go through all the luminaries present, but then another set of luminaries showing how the performing arts would contribute to this in the next slide is a number of major figures in the performing arts. Leonard Bernstein is there in the back, and a number of other people who would have been quite recognizable during the time. This in Look magazine. They're arrayed around a plan, sitting in one of the cleared lots just in front of some of the buildings in the back that are soon to be cleared, showing what will replace the world behind. Okay. Now, also, by the mid-50s, when this project gets underway, this sort of triumphal endeavor has acquired also a more strategic mission as well. And Lincoln Center is called on to provide a symbol of national cultural maturity and urban resurgence that's brandishable in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is actually how people talk about it, not the least of which is John D. Rockefeller. There's a lot of talk about how Lincoln Center might be the thing that will help us to prove that we're not just sort of a nation of Philistines, that we can measure up on the world stage to the Europeans, and of course that we have the internal coherence and the internal security to show our true selves in this time when we're being tested on the world stage. So both urban renewal and the performing arts are envisioned as resources for shoring up the nation's internal cultural defenses. If you show the next slide, you can see a bit of how this looks, right? Lincoln Center brings these two cultural and urban missions together in this one kind of literally shining symbol and gives them concrete form in the cityscape. The complex's sponsors really hoped that it would prove Americans living in an affluent society, this being the term from John Kenneth Galbraith's book of that era, which worried about whether we were fit, whether we really had the resources to deal with whether we had the spiritual resources and the cultural resources to deal with our material well-being in this era. And it hoped that they would hope that this would show, that Lincoln Center would show that we valued spiritual as much as material goods. So it's sort of symbolizing these linked missions by providing Lincoln Center with this setting that's on par with classical European models of urban planning. So it's intended as a kind of American update of a Venetian piazza. Now this image doesn't quite show it quite as well as the next one will, but this one I want to just say is at the groundbreaking. So what you actually have here, it's a little hard to understand this image sometimes. What you have here is Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, speaking from the dais with John D. Rockefeller on the left and Mayor Wagner on the right. And a banner hanging in front of them on the front of the dais that shows the renderings of what the plan thought the plan would look like at groundbreaking. Of course, it changes quite a bit. And you can also see something like some sort of sense of this also in the next slide, which is shows very well the idea behind the planning, right? This update of a Venetian piazza. This is a rendering by the architectural renderer Hugh Ferris. Again, of plans that would go through with some major changes. This is not long after the groundbreaking. But it shows how Lincoln Center offered what Rockefeller called a new kind of city therapy that made culture and the arts the cornerstone of the sort of modernist superblock and open space urban renewal efforts that had floated so many of these projects. Okay. Now, with that vision, however, comes a rather less exalted vision of the people who already lived in the neighborhood. And along with it comes this sort of convenient narrative about what relocation should mean that the Braceland, Porter, and Wheelock folks were picking up and kind of running with. So if you go to the next image, you'll see one of 2 pages, the cover and an inside page from the Lincoln Square Urban Renewal Plan that was put together by Robert Moses' office. It gives you a sense of how they pitched these plans in these very modern documents that had a sort of very precise attention to fonts and to white space and the relationship between dark and light and open space and the photos being bled to the edges of the page. Very precise, very clean, and meant to set off some of the photographs that showed urban squalor around them. And this kind of narrative about the destruction of the city, as it had been true for many years in these kinds of urban reform images intending to get rid of old city spaces, also sort of transferred over to talking and thinking about the people of these places. So in many ways, the story that I told about the Brazen Porter and Wheelock play, that play offers up its own moral. The residents, too ignorant to know what's best for them, will eventually thank the sponsors and their agents for helping them to play a small part in this sort of great drama of civic splendor, of national triumph, and of urban rejuvenation. Now, you can imagine, of course, that that's not quite how the residents saw it. They were hardly so passive. Next slide shows the Lincoln Square, one view of the Lincoln Square streetscape. And here's the world that many of these folks looked to try to protect. The residents and the business people of Lincoln Square organized two committees, one, as I said, made up of residents, the other of neighborhood business people, and they tried to stop the project. And they had a number of different things they did. They picketed, they came up with all kinds of meetings and sort of creative protests around this issue. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a flyer that they put out to go down to the City Planning Commission when the plans were being held. And at this City Planning Commission meeting, they laid out a very different take on what it meant to live in the city in this era. And they talked about a number of different things about their homes. The residents talked about their homes and what they meant to them. And they came up with the idea that their homes should be seen as beauty and culture, just like the plans for Lincoln Square, and a different kind of beauty and culture. It was their private life that was being imperiled there, a sort of private form of culture that the sort of top-down version of culture on offer in Lincoln Center was threatening to get rid of. And so if you go to the next image, you'll see them articulating this in a protest, shelter before culture there. I think this is actually a protest in front of Carnegie Hall, because one of the issues around this was they were going to get rid of Carnegie Hall and move it into Lincoln Square, but that of course didn't happen in Carnegie Hall State. But they also articulated a sort of even more complex idea about this form of culture that was being endangered and imperiled. They talked about a public dimension to this form of culture, not just a private residential form. At Lincoln Square, they said public and private were yoked together by the commercial life of the community. Now, there were 600 places of business in the Lincoln Square neighborhood. So there's staggering variety that is unusual, I think, for Manhattan today, where sometimes chain and big box stores have moved in, but and where most industry has been banished to the boroughs. But in the late 50s, Lincoln Square was a thriving mixed-use neighborhood in the parlance of today, and a roll call of the sort of various establishments that were endangered in this place will give you a good idea of this. This is sort of a long list, so I won't belabor it too much, but it's kind of fun. The things that were there. There were luncheonettes and delicatessens, corner groceries and fruit stands, fish and meat markets, bars and liquor stores, candy stores, beauty parlors, barbers, laundromats, corner pharmacies. All right, a litany of working class institutions, we might say. Usual, we would expect those. There were also, though, hardware stores, print shops, shoe stores, shoe repair places, men's and women's clothing stores, tailors, furniture stores, toy stores, a bike shop, radio and television repair shops, a record store, newsstands, auto parts stores, a Chinese goods store, and a driving school. There were tradespeople, right? There were upholsterers, sign painters, electricians, house painters, plumbers, glaziers, auto mechanics. There was an interior decorator, a photography studio, an office of the Girl Scouts, a funeral parlor, and an embalming academy. There was a motion picture warehouse. There was a detective agency. There was a magazine publisher, a caterer, a breeder of animals for research, at least 2 ball-bearing shops, 2 advertising agencies, and 1 sanitarium for birds. And then there were a number of different kinds of companies that made all kinds of machine parts and metals and things like that. So there was this sort of rich kind of differentiated cityscape. And so the folks who wanted to protect this, the business people tried to articulate what it was that they were going to lose. And they came upon it as a slogan, a term that is somewhat not used these days anymore, but was very much in use in that era, about what it was that a businessman had as his capital, especially a small businessman. If you look at the next slide, you can see this is Abraham Halleckman, who was a small businessman on the site. And he said, look, we're going to lose our goodwill, which was basically an expression of the capital they had in the relationships they had with their customer base. And so they articulated, right, that the relationship between the customers and the businesses of the neighborhood was this kind of capital that could never be replaced. It would be lost. It was what kept them afloat. It would be lost if they were forced to relocate. They were given small sums of money to relocate their fixtures to new businesses, to new places. But they said, look, we're going to lose so much that keeps us going. It's goodwill that will be crushed under the bulldozers' treads. So this notion that their neighborhood embodied this sort of dynamic form of everyday culture, quite distinct from that on offer in the vision of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, sort of gives an answer to the vision of the Braceland Porter and Wheelock play. It shows that they were far from passive or ignorant. It shows that they had a different vision of what urban success and urban life, urban good life could be. Now, this vision wasn't immediately successful, right? It failed to stop urban renewal at Lincoln Square, and we wouldn't want to condemn Lincoln Center itself, which has become, in and of itself, a successful model for urban life, just a different model. But it did, I think, this idea, lay the groundwork for a movement to unmake urban renewal, in combination with some of the other things I've shown you today, other oppositional forces that were bubbling up, that take shape later in the early 1960s with Jane Jacobs, in part, in her book, to reorient and remake urban planning and city rebuilding away from these modern planning ideals. So these lost stories, this evidence of these sort of almost forgotten struggles, give us a new window into the early days of this history, the history of how urban renewal was made and unmade in Manhattan in the 20 years after World War II. Thanks for listening. Of course, yeah, sure. I had to. Ooh. Time there.
We're going to turn the lights up a little bit.
Yeah.
The images of the slum clearance, particularly after World War II, always remind me of the military, and I've always wondered, is there any sense of what the emotional state was of the people involved in this? Because it seems like a whole generation came back from Europe and started tearing down major portions